in the Academy, an academic panel discussion exploring the roles that imagination plays in teaching, learning, scholarship, and creative activities at Trinity University. This panel is part of a series of programs taking place this week to celebrate the official inauguration of President Vanessa Beasley. And so welcome. My name is JJ Lopez, and I'm with Trinity University's KRTU 91.7 FM, and it is an honor to be here today moderating this panel discussion. And I'm going to be honest with you, when I arrived here as a volunteer on Saturday afternoons in 2007, I never would have imagined myself sitting up here doing something this tremendous for Trinity University, and it's a super, super awesome honor. So thanks for having me. To Dwayne and all the team and all the producers, everybody, thank you. What an honor. We have a wonderful group of speakers here today, and I'm very excited to get started. But before we begin, let's take a moment to just briefly meet some of our panelists, and then we'll go over the rules of engagement for the afternoon, and we'll get started with this very cool talk about imagination in the Academy. Let's start first with meeting some of our panelists, and I thought we would meet down here first with Jenny and Jennifer. And we didn't do this on purpose, that it was Jennifer, Jenny, Jade, John, and JJ. It just so happened that way. It's kind of awesome. But let's start down here. On the panel, joining us today, Professor and Chair of Sociology and Anthropology is Dr. Jennifer Matthews. And so we're going to learn a little bit about everybody later as we dive deeper into their background, but also joining us, MFA Professor of English, is Jenny Brown, also a Poet Laureate, San Antonio Poet Laureate. And we also have some wonderful alumni, and we have students involved today on the panel. Jade Bondi, class of 2023. She's a double major in biology and international studies with a global health concentration. Jade, thanks for joining us. Also joining us here is no stranger to KRTU. John has joined us on the air a number of times. John Burnham, class of 2010. He is co-founder of Kalos, and this is a new initiative. So John, thanks for joining us here. And making our way over this way, Dr. Mario Gonzalez, PhD, Associate Professor of Business Administration. Mario, thank you so much for joining today. Also, Dr. Wilson Terrell, the Associate Professor, Engineering Science, and Associate Vice President for Academic Affairs, Inclusive Excellence. Wilson, thank you so much for joining. Also joining us is Dr. Matthew Hibbs, the Associate Professor of Computer Science. Dr. Hibbs, thank you so much. And also a student joining today, Omari Kimbrough, class of 2025, a major in applied physics. Omari, thanks so much for coming and joining today. All right. Okay, as moderator, just a few rules of the engagement. I will keep time today just to keep us on time. So if we're in the middle of something, I give you a small cue. It's just to keep us on time because we want to make it to 5:20, and then we want to make it to 5:30 on time. We're going to ask questions in sort of groups, the way we've discussed laying out the panel today. But I invite you all to engage in it. So if you have a question for the panelists across here, which I invite you all to discuss, just raise your hand, and then we'll call on you, and then we'll engage a question. And if I can't see you, say, JJ, put me in, coach, and then we'll go like that. Also, at the very end, we'll have a brief Q&A, so if you'll just please hold your questions, we'll do a Q&A about 5 o'clock for everybody. Okay, let's get started. What an honor it is to be here talking about imagination in the Academy. I thought it would be nice, before we get started, if we could maybe define imagination. This is kind of one of those things. Is it a concept? Is it a tool? Is it a springboard for change? In all my research, it's all of that. And I think we think about and use imagination every day. But I thought it would be nice just to orient us so that we're all kind of in the same space when we talk about imagination, to have a working definition of some sort. And I looked it up. So imagination can be defined as the act or power of forming a mental image of something not present to the senses or never before wholly perceived in reality. You know, when I met the founders of KRTU, they were students in 1975 at Trinity, and I remember speaking with them, and they told me that they imagined that Trinity could have a radio station, that San Antonio should have another college radio, a non-commercial radio station, and it was something they imagined, and they saw it to fruition on January 23rd, 1976. And so this is the application of something never before or wholly perceived in reality. Also in sports, we don't have sports representation here, but if you're a sports fan, you imagine getting to the goal. You imagine winning the game. But also, as a creative ability, we can think of imagination to confront and deal with problems and problem solving. I think everybody uses imagination in this capacity, and I'm really interested to speak to some of our science department folks over here, using imagination to think beyond and to solve problems. But also, in the sense of a creation of the mind, imagination can be an idealized or a poetic creation. And so, Jenny, we talked about this, right? You had mentioned in our preliminary meeting as a group, the word imagination has the word image in it. Tell us a little bit more about that. What were your thoughts on that?
Well, I guess it's somewhat predictable that when we began kind of talking about this, I went straight to sort of thinking about the word itself, and in some ways you have the word imagination, but it contains the word image, which is really, as you mentioned earlier, kind of, I think, the fundamental building block, at least in literature, of how we see, we think of someone else's life and experience. And even more than that, I liked how you said an image is something that we understand with our senses. And that's certainly, kind of when my students ask, what makes a good poem? Well, I don't have the answer. Some of my students are here. I don't know. but I do know that it has to have images and it has to have mystery. And one of the things I was thinking about is, when you come across an image, someone describing something in a way that you can really comprehend or apprehend what they're talking about, those words come from the same root. Here I go again with the words of prehensile, like a prehensile tale. So when I thought about the interdisciplinarity of this is, image, and by connection, imagination is how we grasp a possibility, the next thing. I just loved that sense, that to comprehend and to, that word comes from the idea to grasp, how we grasp where we are and what is possible.
Nice. Yeah, and hold on to that, because we're going to dive a little bit deeper into the role of imagination in poetry and archaeology and anthropology, and I'm excited to talk to you all about it. Nice. So I think we're having a little bit of a working definition of imagination. In popular culture, I don't know why the year 1971 stood out in some of my research, but a famous philosopher, Willy Wonka, described pure imagination as, if you want to view paradise, simply look around and view it. Anything you want to, do it. Want to change the world? There's nothing to it. There is no life I know to compare with pure imagination. Living there, you will be free if you truly wish to be. So there we find it in popular culture. But interestingly enough, also in 1971, John Lennon asked us to imagine all the people living life in peace. And that's kind of a nice notion, right? Something was happening in 1971. To prepare for this talk, like any good researcher, I went to YouTube and I dug deep into the TED Talks. I just wanted to see who else is talking about this in a deeper way. And I stumbled across Charles Faulkner, who's a neurolinguistic researcher who pulled Immanuel Kant to talk a little bit about imagination. And I think this pulls us in a little closer as we start to think about imagination in the academy. And so Charles Faulkner suggested through Immanuel Kant that imagination works according to our instruments of perception, our instruments of understanding, our mental operating system. Kant suggested that we do not see the world the way it is, we see the world as our instruments allow, and that's kind of nice. Taking it a step further, Faulkner concludes his talk by saying that imagination and knowledge are complementary and complete each other. It's like they're in an endless dance in which imagination leads. That's kind of sweet, that's kind of nice, and I think that brings us a little closer into the academy and where we're at. And let's begin our panel discussion now, if we're all kind of on board with that many working definitions of imagination. So, imagination in the academy is our topic today, and we were given a prompt, so I want to thank Dwayne for kind of setting us off in the right direction here. And he asked us in a preliminary meeting, when we think of imagination in the academy, in what ways do you see yourself? And we have some more targeted questions that we want to dive into. What ways does imagination play a role in your work? And I think in this way we get to understand what's happening at Trinity imagination. I want to begin with Jennifer and with Jen, and sort of this imagination in the humanities and the social sciences a little bit. And Jennifer, we had a wonderful conversation about your work down in Mexico, which I'm a huge fan of Mayan culture. And so I wanted you to share with us a little bit, in what ways does imagination play a role in your work in cultural anthropology and archaeology? You have to imagine another civilization that we don't really have access to, but we do with your good work. Tell us about that.
So I'm a Maya archaeologist. I've worked in the Yucatan Peninsula for about 30 years now, and
Pull the mic a little closer.
A little closer there.
Yeah.
And so oftentimes we can't actually see what it is we are trying to understand, and so we have to fill in the blanks with trying to find material culture or other resources that can help us imagine what those ancient civilizations would have looked like. And so I study everything from very old civilizations 3,000, 4,000 years ago to the 19th century. And actually I found that the 19th century has some of the biggest holes in the archaeological record. And so I've been filling in some of these with oral histories of descendant communities, talking to them about their interpretations of their own past. I've also been doing a lot of work on commodity studies from the 19th century, things like chicle or bubble chewing gum, sugarcane and rum. And I've been interviewing contemporary distillers of booze in the United States to help fill in some of those ideas. So one of my most interesting interviews was with the head distiller at George Washington's distillery in Mount Vernon, who's still using 19th century techniques to kind of fill in those holes.
Nice. And I know also I didn't want to lose sight of this. We had also talked about indigenous voices, and you had discussed imagining that there's an inclusion component here, right? We need to imagine that more voices are at the table. And can you talk a little bit more about that?
Yeah, sure. So in my field of anthropology, this is a colonized field, right? It's often been conducted by powerful, wealthy, Western white people studying the other. And I think what we're envisioning in anthropology and archaeology these days is a different kind of field that is more inclusive, and using instead our platform to make space for indigenous voices. And so creating places where they are contributing and leading the questions that are being asked. Instead of us coming up with the questions, going to indigenous communities and saying, what do you want to know about the past? Going to contemporary communities and saying, what are the problems going on in these communities that you want to address? How do we work together, rather than us saying what the agenda is going to be, you making the agenda and asking the questions. And I think re-envisioning a discipline that is more forward-thinking in terms of ethically treating skeletal remains and cultural remains that should be returned to indigenous communities. And so in our department, for example, we have been working with local Native American nonprofit groups. We have students that are interning with them, doing oral histories, and learning how to ethically return remains in museum collections, university collections, etc.
I think you described it as reimagine a non-Western narrative in this work that you're doing. Is that it?
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's recognizing that we shouldn't be the only ones telling the stories, right? These aren't necessarily our stories to tell. And so taking a step back and saying, how do we make a more inclusive space for indigenous voices to tell their own histories?
Yeah. Nice. I really am taken by some of the work that's done right now over the jungles of Guatemala and in the Yucatan, where radar is now giving us access to see how advanced these civilizations really were. But you cannot see it. You see the sort of the topography of these, the pyramids and things that are under the vegetation. So I think it requires a bit of imagination, right, to see and imagine what was it like. They were so vast.
Absolutely. I have a good friend who has worked at an archaeological site in Belize for close to 30 years, and they had mapped what they thought was the entire site over this time period, and then they had this LiDAR, or these beams that shoot down lasers and send you back images, and what they discovered is after 25 years or 30 years of mapping, they had actually only mapped 13% of the site. And so these technologies are complete game changers, and I asked him, is this exciting or utterly depressing? And he said a little bit of both.
I think it's exciting, right? Because now you see there's a great deal of work to be done down there. Nice. Well, Jenny, I wanted to talk a little bit about poetry, and I don't want to lose sight of this because I think the way in which you use imagination in this work that both of you do might be something that we could think about how it works with sciences and juxtapose those two. But tell us about poetry and imagination. How are the two intertwined? And I know you have a good insight here.
I mean, I have lots to say specifically about poetry, but one thing, what Jen Matthews just said about making new questions makes me think about, you're really one of the first poets and poems that mattered to me in the sense of really the imaginative possibilities of poetry, and that was the great Chilean poet Pablo Neruda, and he has a book called The Book of Questions. And we could argue whether or not these are poems, and I often do with my students, but I remember sitting in a classroom, and one of the lines, it's a book of 72 pages, 72 couplets, and they're just all, one could say, questions that don't have answers, or questions that perhaps the point wasn't to have an answer, but rather to develop a mind that asks these kind of questions. And the one, there I was in 8th grade or whenever, and the line was, "Tell me, is the rose naked, or is that her only dress?" And I just remember gasping and thinking, I don't really care. I just want to I just want to be able to kind of imagine these questions that I haven't, or how many churches are there in heaven? Where did the moon hide its sack of moonlight? How do the seasons know when it is time to change their shirt? I mean, it truly is one of my favorite texts, not just because it's delightful to read, but because it really does, I think, that work that not just poetry does, but I think everyone here does, I would imagine, in terms of shaping a question that may not have a clear answer, but that you work toward a response or an investigation or an experiment or company, and so I think that's exciting to me.
Yeah.
And and in terms of poetry itself, I think obviously there is this sense that in some ways, what can a poem do? And as someone who's worked sort of as a civically appointed poet for many years in the city and in the state, what good is poetry? And I think poetry allows us to imagine the really power and possibility of language itself. It allows us to imagine ourselves individually and collectively in a range of contexts. It allows us to imagine ways of processing emotion through form, in time. And so just the very act of engaging with this tradition, I think, opens it up to all sorts of ways to enact imagination, I think would be, the way that I talk about it. I mean, I started with Neruda. Often on one of the first days in class, I'll tell my students a story about having a younger, this was when I was working as a poet in the schools for many years before I went back to graduate school and entered the academy, and I made the mistake of getting a classroom of 4th graders talking about dead pets, and I just lost complete control. And but one of these little boys, and I tell the story a lot in the classroom, came up to me and wrote a poem about his dog, and it basically went, "I was really sad the day my dog died. I cried and cried. It was the saddest day of my life, the day my dog died." How does he feel? He feels sad, right? But I said, "Hey, I can tell you really miss your dog. Maybe you could tell me a little bit more about her so I could imagine her a little more fully, so I can know what it is you you miss. And so he kind of squirreled up his face and looked at me and went back to his desk. And then a few minutes later came back, and he'd written really one sentence, and this was 25 years ago, that I still wish I would have written. And this is all it said. It said, "Every time I look at the air, I miss my dog because she always tried to catch it in her teeth." Every time I look at the air, but I mean that, so at a big kind of opening level, but also getting down to that one image that is actually going to help others imagine your life is really how I think imagination and poetry relate.
Yes, I like that. A springboard that to some fantastical way of thinking of way maybe things don't work like that in reality, but this imagination as a springboard allows us to explore these ideas that are maybe beyond. That's it, they're just beyond. So, but let's not lose sight of that, because I think that's kind of what I was speculating where we would land, and I would definitely want to talk a little bit about how it's in the sciences too. But let's keep moving now a little bit. Thank you both for that. That was so awesome. And we're going to hold on to springboard, and we're going to hold on to imagining ourselves. But I want to shift the conversation, because we've got to move it forward just a little bit. And now think about and talk about imagination in entrepreneurship, in business, and in international studies. And for my set of questions here, I want to talk to Jade and to John and to Mario. But Jade, I want to start with you. We had talked a little bit earlier, and I had asked you a question that maybe I wanted you to think a little bit about. This is not related to business or anything, but your student experience. After you were accepted to Trinity University, was there a little window of time there where you were imagining what that experience was going to be like? Could you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah. So I think there was a window where I was thinking about my experience at Trinity, or what it would be. I think I focused on maybe like what was already there. So I kind of looked into my interests, or like what majors I was interested in, and that changed over my time at Trinity. But then I looked at how they intersected. So I was interested in geoscience and biology initially when I came to Trinity, and also anthropology, but I really wanted to see, like, I guess navigate the specific interest that intersects all three of those different areas, so I could like figure out what I wanted to do on my college journey. I think I also thought about like how I would be able to fit in or get involved on campus. And so I think Trinity has like a list of organizations that Trinity has, so I was looking at that. But really, I kind of took my experience in high school and was like, okay, so how can I continue like getting involved and participating in the things that I was involved in? And so I think I got involved in Rotaract Club because I was in Interact Club in high school, but that was already there at Trinity. And I think throughout my time as a student here, then I kind of transitioned to more what can I contribute to Trinity and what isn't there already that I can help make happen. And so I think, yeah, I guess use imagination in that way to envision like how I would fit into the campus. So that was like when I first came to Trinity, or when I was thinking about going to Trinity, and now it's more like how can I contribute to the environment and like help make the changes to make it better. Nice. Awesome. Well, John, as an alum, you too must have been in this time where you were at Trinity and you were imagining, but you've already finished and now you're out in the world. I want to kind of hone in on something we talked in our preliminary meeting, which was reimagining skills. And so while students are developing these skills and they're experiencing all these different projects and getting involved in imagining how they're going to get out into the world, in our preliminary meeting, you talked about reimagining skills and your field of study and how may you apply it to something completely different. Can you talk a little bit about that? I thought that was totally cool.
Yeah, sure. So I graduated in 2010. I was an art history major, classics double major, minor in religion and religious studies, and then went on and did a master's of theological studies. So none of those things are remotely associated with the work I do today or the things that you see on my bio. And so for me, the things that it's been a process of learning have kind of honed in on the fact that the critical thinking skills that were taught kind of universally in all of those subject areas not only provided a basis for knowing that I had the ability to learn, right? Knowing and having confidence in the fact that I would have the ability to learn and master new skills, because you had to do it. In one classroom, you're learning about Greek vases, and then the next minute you're over here in a business finance course. And at the time, those two things don't necessarily seem like they connect, but over time, as you build the muscles with it, you definitely start to see the underpinning and the current in which they all flow in together. And then it also really kind of gives you the sense that, the sense of knowing that or I guess the excitement of learning new things. So, and how that excitement is what also fuels reimagining the way in which you wanted the world to look, and the way in which you want to be a part of designing the way the world looks. And in particular, the way in which we want to redesign the way the workforce looks. That's been something that's been important to me, is how do I create a workforce, or how do I help design a workforce that may not exist today, but is going to exist 50 years from now, that's going to meet the needs of my children's children as they're entering the workforce. And so the excitement that comes from the opportunity to learn and engage with new ideas and intersections, I think it really is what kind of carries over. And even just thinking about, just right before this, talking about invasive grass, those are the things that the little nuggets that you can take out of every conversation that not only help contribute to opportunities to engage with other people later on, but also be able to recall that at some point, that it might help you build something else, or might help you go somewhere else, or do something new.
Yeah. I think you talked about reimagining the workplace as a more equitable environment, is what you discussed. Is that right? Yeah.
So one of the things for me is, I feel like one of the great things, the great skills that developed here at Trinity, and when I was in graduate school, were just sort of the way in which the market system works is not conducive to happy, healthy lives, right, in a lot of ways. And so one of my big passions was, when I started my first business, was wanting to become a B corporation, and making sure that not only the impacts of the work that we were doing we could identify and demonstrate that there was positive impact for the people and the organizations we worked with, but then also how do I take that a step further and measure downstream? How do I know that I'm not just pushing poverty somewhere else? Right? How do I think about my work, the way it affects the people that work with me, the clients we serve, and then the people who are laboring and producing the things that we are using? How do I include their voice in that conversation? Mm-hmm. How do I include the environment? How do I include, as a forebearer, how do you include generations of people to come? And those things are difficult and don't always have answers, which is why the use of imagination is important, and working that muscle is critical.
Yeah. I want to talk a little bit about global and international studies in a cultural way, but Jenny, you had mentioned something in our preliminary meeting about futuring, and so that this kind of reminds me a little bit of that, what John's talking about. You want to talk a little bit about that?
Yeah. So I guess in public health, I feel like it's maybe a little easier finding and identifying the problems, but it's a little harder to find the solution. And I think that I guess kind of going off of what John was talking about, of taking different perspectives, then especially international studies, then you have to think about the people who would be impacted. That may not be just local, but also international. And I guess the international studies, and I've taken courses in a range of disciplines, from politics to biology, and so I can look at issue from different perspectives. So for example, disease, how does politics relate to the spread of disease, or from the biological mechanisms to the spread of disease and that stuff. And I guess I was fortunate last semester to study abroad in different countries and learn about the different healthcare systems. And so I think in that aspect it was I guess interesting seeing how different countries are I guess managing the health of their citizens. And I think by bringing in imagination, could really see or envision how the citizens there fit into their society, and as me as a foreigner fit into that society, but also use them to learn from, and maybe combine it with different ideas maybe here too that would contribute to further change.
Yeah. Using imagination to imagine change as a change agent or something like that on a national scale. Well, Mario, you've had a lot of experience traveling around the world, and we were talking earlier about Japan, Vietnam, Cuba, Spain, a lot of your exchange work. But I do want to ask about imagination in a marketing capacity and a storytelling capacity. But as we're talking about changing the work environment, making an equity environment, working in terms of global health, would you want to contribute to that, jump in on that?
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you, JJ. So one of my strands of research is studying the way that storytelling engages audiences, or the way that brands use storytelling to engage audiences. And the reason why I like that is twofold. One, engagement is a way to nurture inclusivity, diversity, right? When you bring audiences together to share stories. But if you think about it, the reason why I really like stories is because a story starts or begins in one mind and ends in another. And there are blank spaces there that need to be filled by the audience. And so, if you will, there is a process of co-creation or co-imagination, right, in between the storyteller and the story receiver. Stories are an opportunity to simulate, to imagine what if this happens to me, right? We rejoice and suffer, with what happens to a soccer coach like Ted Lasso. Not because we have all coached an English team or even know what that is like, but because we connect with Ted Lasso, the human being, and his tribulations, right? So a story is a way to learn from different scenarios, right? To project visions of what's possible, as Jenny, mentioned earlier. But stories are also vehicles for meaning. Stories are always more than just the form that they are, received by the audience, being a book, a movie, a newscast, whatever that story, the form is. They're usually, packaging universal ideas, that people pick up from them, right? And the funny and interesting thing about meaning is that studies have shown that when we make decisions emotionally, the brain immediately okays it by storyfying it, right? It's like, oh, I made this, decision very emotionally, very impulsively, and the brain goes like, let me build a story around it so I can okay it, right? And so it's all good, right? Like we can tell ourselves a story about it. But I think the most important one, and I think bringing these ideas of inclusivity and equity, right, and international cooperation, together, stories are a way to help others. They're pieces of advice, right? That's the reason why sometimes people talk about a story, something that happened to them, and they say, this is a cautionary tale, right? We call them like that, a cautionary tale, right? The word parable, right, to pair with, to pair someone's problem or tribulation with a story, right? But that's the funny thing, is that telling stories to help others, in order to do that, we need to show ourselves as vulnerable. And people are very afraid of being vulnerable nowadays, because vulnerability has been equated with, in this world, with weakness, right? However, the future, is about vulnerability. The only way that we're gonna beat the machines and Terminators is by being human beings, so, yeah.
Nice. Does anybody care? Anybody just checking in? Does anybody have any questions or want to jump in at any point? Okay. Well, Jenny, let's circle back around on futuring, because I remember you had spoken about it in our talk a little bit. Did you want to add to that?
Oh, I don't know. I mean,
look at my kids and just how sometimes it's just funny watching them just imagine things. I think that makes me, I see that, how they see things, and I want to be able to kind of see what they see, to be informed about what their perspective. And I think that's important. Sometimes I think a lot of times we think about things just in the realm of ourselves, and we have to think about others to be able to make very informed decisions, especially being in academic affairs. That we're first and foremost really focused and really guarded when it comes to academic freedom, and being able for faculty to imagine things, to be able to ask our students the difficult, challenging questions on to get them to think beyond what they're currently at and really be lifelong learners. And in order to do that, you have to have imagination. And in order to have imagination, you can't stifle it.
Nice. I think that deserves a round of applause. Nice. Well, we've got a little over 15 minutes. We're going to take it up to 5 o'clock, and then we want to get some questions from the audience. But I want to continue with Matthew. Now, Matthew, I did a little bit of looking into your research, and I think I know imagination plays an important role here. It was me trying to imagine that work. It was hurting my brain. It was really, it was awesome. It is about problem solving. It's imagining a solution to aging and to cancer. But tell me about this intersection of computer science and data and biology and the role of imagination in all of that.
Sure. So it's really interesting to come from the perspective, or I think it's interesting to come from the perspective that I do, where I sort of straddle the biological sciences and computer science, because they both use imagination in similar and in different ways. A biologist is really having to imagine what mechanisms are underpinning how we all live, what leads to disease, what leads to different processes. And I am constantly fascinated by how little we know about biology, how little we know about how the brain works, about how cancer develops. There's always so much more to learn. And it all starts with a hypothesis, with an idea of what might be happening there. And on the other extreme, in computer science world, a lot of our imagination is put into how to solve problems. We have fairly well-defined problems that we want to solve, and we need to get these really dumb machines called computers to solve them for us. And that requires a lot of work of breaking things down into smaller, simpler steps. And trying to bridge those two, of taking the imagination of conceiving what could possibly be happening in our brain and translate that down into what is the computer going to do about that is quite the leap. And I've been amazed over a long time, but especially in the last 5 to 10 years, how much artificial intelligence is making huge strides in closing that gap, or at least narrowing the gap in those different forms of imagination. I made a comment in our initial session. I feel like computer science for so long has been about problem solving, and we focus on how to solve specific problems. But now that the AIs are getting better and better at solving specific problems, I think our field is going to transition into more thinking about what problems need to be solved and less about how to solve those specific problems. And I think that's going to be a profound change for my field. I know it's just rearranging a few words, but it's a very different way of thinking about problems. And I think Trinity is positioned really well to train students in that, because we're not just trying to convey the technical, how do you make the computer add 2 numbers together? We're really trying to figure out what are the ethics of how I add these 2 numbers together. I've trained this AI model on the totality of human history, but who wrote down that history? What does that mean my model is learning? And having that broader perspective is really going to be more and more important as we move forward.
Nice.
Because this technology isn't going anywhere. It's just going to continue very rapidly.
Yeah. What I've doing research on your research, it seemed to me that you're imagining better accessibility to the data, to understand it, and in some ways, Wilson, this reminds me of something you said, which is accessibility to the sciences as a whole for our students. You want to comment or talk a little bit about that?
I think in terms of science, I think that all our students need to be involved in some sort of science in some degree or I always remember this chemistry class. It's the chemistry of crime, and also there was also another one, chemistry of art, I believe, or connecting or making it accessible for non-STEM students access to STEM. I think that is very, very important. Just as it's important for our STEM students to have a broad-based education, to learn the humanities, to learn the humanities and arts, the social sciences, the businesses. Again, as we start talking about the questions in the future, it's going to be like, what questions do we need to solve? And having that perspective in these different areas, I think, is really the strength of Trinity.
Nice.
I would just echo that as well, that with all of these artificial intelligence advancements, the technical bar of entry is going to continue to get lower. And I think we're going to see the ability for a broader range of people to access computational power to do a whole wide range of tasks, more than we've been able to do in the past.
Well, quickly is what I'm gathering, right? Well, leaps and bounds.
Yeah, the exponential growth is amazing. We learned a lot during the pandemic.
I want to speak to Amory about some of the work that you're doing here at Trinity and all of this imagination in the realm of physics. First, tell us a little bit about things that interest you and that you're working on here at Trinity. Amory?
So I am an applied physics major, but I concentrate on the cross-section of physics and chemistry. And as a result, I find myself currently doing biophysical research where I attempt to use biological molecules to map the physical characterization of systems that we cannot otherwise readily look at, like the transition point between when glass becomes a solid.
Nice. And I'm just going to go for it. I'm just going to give it a shot.
Yeah.
But imagination is important here, right? I mean, because you don't have access to that, but you have to imagine this is what's happening, and I'm connecting the dots. Am I off here? I'm sure I'm off.
You're mostly right. A lot of the research that I currently do is extremely esoteric, in that any time you try to find a paper that works with the same mechanisms that we are, they're basically trying to do a very specific thing and don't explain how they did it. Okay. So when we're trying to get a very specific interaction between the chemicals that we work it with, we have to really look at a fundamental level and try to imagine that they're going to work, because we think we understand what they're trying to do, what we're trying to do and what they're going to do, but then it doesn't work, and we have to try and imagine. I think this it bounces off what Dr. Hibbs was trying to say, is we're trying to imagine what's going wrong and what what problem we need to address, because there's a level of, well, it's not working, we don't know why, so now we have to at least take a guess at why it's not working, which takes a lot of imagination that I think I have.
You have it. You have it. Yeah, trust me. We believe that you have it. And well, Wilson, I think it's like heat dynamics is what we're trying to envision it or understand it, right? Like, you don't have access to it, but you have to envision that's the process of it.
Right. You have to look at the processes and imagine what processes could be occurring.
Yeah.
Sometimes you don't see them. That's the biggest challenge. Sometimes we don't see what we're looking at in terms of STEM. Sometimes we don't see it directly. We have to kind of look at indirect means, and that's where instruments really come into play. Yeah. Is how do you come up with how do you utilize instruments to get information to help you make more informed decisions?
Yes. Nice.
Yeah, I think that also kind of plays back to what you were saying about Immanuel Kant, about how we see the world through how our instruments allow. And
that's right.
The reason we can't look directly at glass is because just instruments don't allow it. And neither our physical instruments or any of the instruments we've concocted in a laboratory. And I think that aside from that, really that's where imagination comes into play, is that what we can't see as well.
Nice.
Yeah.
thank you so much, gentlemen, for that explanation. I learned a lot also. But I think this lands us in a really good place. I want to thank you all for the awesome conversation. I want to back it out just a little bit, and I want to pose a question to the group, and maybe amongst yourselves we can discuss this. But we have explored imagination in a variety of ways through different lenses, through anthropology and through English and through writing and through poetry, as it applies to how we imagine a better world in terms of business and entrepreneurship and storytelling. Then we look at the sciences and how the sciences use imagination. I think there's a lot of commonalities there. It's a springboard for ideas. It's an opportunity to see something that is not there. A change agent. It's a simulation of sorts. So I wanted to ask, when we apply imagination or exercise imagination, specifically in the academy, are there different parameters that we consider? And now, Jenny, you said something earlier, and I don't know if I'm asking it right, but we'll work on it here. When we think about a poem or we write literature or tell a story, an opportunity, you said this earlier, it's quite broad in the way we imagine the end of the story of the poem. But when we think about sciences, it's a fixed outcome that we want to accomplish, and there may be parameters there. So I don't know. What are y'all's thoughts on that? I know there are similarities, but is there a difference there?
Try to say something.
Maybe give a few seconds for that.
Yeah, so I think, at least for computer science, we do tend to have well-defined problems. You start with the problem definition, and then you're trying to figure it out from there. But I think we're seeing more problems that are poorly defined, that we're still trying to solve. I think about all of, the other big thing that I was thinking about in preparing for this panel was all of the artificial imaginations that we're developing. All these DALL-E systems, ChatGPT, all the stuff that you're seeing in the news. And those are really asking a different question, right? They're saying, can you make a plausible picture given this text description? And that is a specific problem, but it's very open-ended. It's very different than what's the fastest route to deliver these 6 packages to these 4 houses, right? And we're seeing more and more methodologies that I think is starting to bridge that divide between the purely technical, base level questions and the more grandiose, creative, human questions. Yeah.
Nice.
I mean, one thing that, were you guys, no, okay, we pointed me. I mean, one thing that, obviously, when you write a sonnet, you have a goal. There are ways in which part of the pleasure of creative writing is sort of exploring the unknown, but it is also like engaging in a tradition, and so I think that's an interesting piece of it, or sort of what we expect about certain kinds of narratives. But there was something that you said in, that just had me thinking, because there's also this paradox of sort of the idea of what we can't imagine, like I can't imagine, and we talk a lot about the empathy that we can have for each other through storytelling, but there's also limits to that, and that's sort of a paradox. But I have to say, I was, when you said we learned a lot during the pandemic, it just flashed me to that moment of all of us sitting here all of us in this room could not have imagined, but certainly could not have imagined very specific things about our work, our time with our students, and sort of had to find a way, to kind of reimagine our roles here. And I was on a panel this weekend, not like this, but I was working with a doctor. We were talking, and she works with trauma victims' children. And she said that she had other people in the arts in her life from undergrad who said, they say to her, I wish I had gone into something useful, like you, or, like fixing trauma, kids who've had injuries. And she said this thing that really struck me, and I keep thinking of it as we sit here. She said, well, I can fix them, but I don't want to bring them back to a world without all these other things. And that has just sat with me, this notion of having both. You can fix the injury, but you also are bringing them back to something that hopefully is still open for possibility. So.
Yeah, Mario?
Yeah, It's interesting, all these productive collisions, right? But it's interesting that Jenny mentioned a paradox, right? Like, because I always think about stories and storytelling as also sources of paradox. One of my favorite movies is this Spanish director, Julio Medem. And in this movie, the main protagonist is writing a story that he says has two advantages. The first one, he says, is that at the end of the story, a hole opens and you're returned at some point in the middle of the story. The second advantage is that from that point, you can change the story being told. So I really think that stories allow you to, this idea of travel in time, powerful stories will allow you to reconsider your past or revisit and reflect on your past, but also to re-envision future, right? And that in itself is a paradox, because I think, so stories are both, they both ground us, but also at the same time allow us to transport ourselves. I think that tension is delicious, if you allow me, right? Because it is in that paradox that we find our identities, which are always in flux, and we define ourselves in that. So, yeah, just...
I think one of the things that's interesting, especially thinking about the idea of AI, and the things that it's going to solve, the things that it's going to put out of business, the things that aren't even here that it's going to change, right? One of the things I think about as we do like community building work with groups that are oftentimes marginalized, oftentimes are busy doing just surviving at subsistence level, is how do we, knowing that we have tools that are already going to answer the questions that maybe we like traditionally think that as experts in an area we're stepping in to address, how do we reimagine or reinterpret our role as helping people who haven't had the opportunity to really flex the muscle of imagination do that? Because knowing that they have the experience to help build something, but how do we pivot into that sort of coaching role, or that sort of sitting back and just sitting with people as they're learning how to go through that discovery process themselves? Because I think the benefit of being at a university like this is honestly the privilege of being able to sit around a room with people who are all brilliant in their areas, and being able to think, to take in information, to think about it, to regurgitate it, to then share it with colleagues. But the vast majority of the world does not live in that kind of condition, right? And so how do we help take the tools that we have here and help in positions of life, actually help groups imagine and design their own solutions to problems? Because we may be able to imagine a solution, but it doesn't necessarily mean it's the right one, or it doesn't necessarily mean it's the right process. And so how do we use those critical skills to do some of that, I think, is one of the things that I've been thinking about as we've all been talking as well.
I just wanted to jump in and say one of the things that I've appreciated about this conversation is that, you talked about the source of limitations and how do we work around it. And one of the things that I see is people figuring out how do we work around those limitations, how do we not let those stop us. And for me, it's about optimism, it's about future thinking, it's about making the world better, right? And I really appreciate that consistently every one of you has brought up that kind of optimism and hope, which is a pretty remarkable thing considering what we've all been through in the last few years. And so that really makes me excited to hear these conversations.
Yeah. And I think that kind of flips the question. Well, we find that there are more similarities in our understanding, our approach and interpretation of imagination, problem solving, futuring, and looking at the future in that way. Thank you all so much. So awesome. How about a round of applause for the panelists? Wow. Awesome. Well, we've got some time here, and we have a microphone that's right over here off to the side, and we want to welcome some folks to kind of step up and to ask questions of our panelists. Do we have anybody any questions? Or just raise your hand if you don't want to get up and just shout it from the back there. Are there any questions? Yes, sorry.
I have a question about sort of the limits of imagination. Everybody talked about, or most people talk about, imagining the future, imagining the unknown. I have a tremendous difficulty sometimes imagining the known. faces there. I mean, I can think of trivial examples, like, I can read that a fan rotates, 200 revolutions a second. I can't imagine that. I understand there are stars that rotate, 100 times a second. I can't imagine that. The computer does billions of operations in a second. I mean, these are things that are actually happening. Google searches are answered like that. And, I can listen to a particular passage in a Beethoven symphony, and just my jaw drops, my breath is taken away. And how do I imagine how someone could come up with that? And I can read the equations, I can read the numbers, and they don't help with my I don't know how one develops an intuition or imagination. I almost think that for me at least, the answers might be through storytelling or poetry or art or something to give me some sense of the awesomeness of these things that are happening.
Panelists?
I mean, I think one of the things I've learned is that people learn differently. And I think that's really important to understand. When I'm in a class, I might teach conduction, heat transfer through conduction through materials. And one student, if I explain it one way, they'll get it. And then I explain it a different way, another student's going to get it. As I say, people are different and people think differently. And so I think how do we, as educators, how do we reach out and how do we get people to understand? And I think that goes back to your thing about when we're working with people, let's say in the community, how do we help them understand? I think we do that by seeing them where they're at. I think that's the most important thing is we see people where they're at, not where we think they should be at necessarily sometimes.
Nice. Thank you, Wilson. Anybody else care to jump in on the limits of imagination?
I'll say something real
Oh,
fast, sorry.
Yes.
I also agree that I think storytelling is really important, and I feel like that is part of the whole reason of reading a book, to understand the world through that character's eyes and to understand what that author was trying to convey. And selfishly, I think interactive media, the fancy term for video games, has become a really interesting vehicle for this, because there's a difference in actually controlling the character and making choices for that character. And there's extra challenges in a designer or developer imagining all of those different possibilities rather than just the one track to go through. So I agree that storytelling is really important, and I think we're seeing new and different modes of storytelling that make it even more possible to get at some of that imagination.
I also think there's a difference, just sort of picking up on what I said earlier, between saying I can't imagine and I don't want to. And I'm just moved by, your spirit of wanting to. And as, our favorite English department student, I have found your interest in wanting to imagine through other avenues than your area of expertise just totally inspiring. So give yourself a break.
Nice. Okay, nice. Okay, any other questions? I think that worked out okay. You don't have to use the microphone. If you have a question, just raise your hand. And no questions? Okay, I'm not missing anybody, right? Okay, last chance. Okay, yes, Dr. Mustaine.
Paul went into a dark place. I'm going to go into a dark place. I was thinking about Dr. Carol Jr. playing Mother Sorry, that story's I'm going to use that. No, but I'm thinking about how lovely that is. And Jenny Brown's fourth grader. Good Lord, that sentence. Right? Yeah. And what it is that kids are able to do. Right? And the way in which imagination is so easy for kids in a way that it isn't for us. Right? Not all kids and not
What kills imagination?
Including calls.
I'm not a psychiatrist or a psychologist, but as someone who has probably passed the point of my imagination slowly dying at this point, I think one of the reasons that we tend to interpret children as having a very overactive and really being in touch with their imagination is because they don't know a lot. I think knowledge itself has the potential to kill imagination almost, because you know, children don't know a lot about the world, so they have to fill in the gaps themselves. They take that unknown, which is most things, and to do what a lot of us panelists have been doing, and that we place in our own imagination of what we think could be there. And then as you start to learn about what the world is, you start having fewer and fewer gaps to fill in, which I think touches upon what Dr. Hibbs was saying. I keep picking on Dr. Hibbs, I'm sorry, but his research is the closest to mine. That eventually we start having a lack of unknowns to fill in, and we have to start creating our own unknowns that we want to use our imagination to fill in.
Nice. Maybe knowledge does do that. I think, when we, from a musical standpoint, when we discover a new genre, we dive into it, we learn everything we want to know about that musical genre, we learn the history, and slowly, the more you discover, you become an aficionado of this particular subgenre of jazz. And after a while, you're on the hunt to look for the next out album, and I think you're onto something, right? You hear other avant-garde albums, you've heard them 100 times, and so you're thirsty for this sense of imagination and adventure. So maybe there's something to that. I like that, Marie. Thank you. Anybody? Oh, yeah, Jade?
Yeah. I guess just hearing everyone's perspective on imagination, I feel like I've come to think that imagine's kind of never ending, because even if you're young and you have a different type of imagination where you may have a little bit more wild ideas or creativity and that stuff, I think that now, even if we have more knowledge and we still use imagination to make understandings of different things. And I think it's even occurs across disciplines, where maybe in one discipline you come to a conclusion, but then another discipline may pick up that problem or that conclusion and have more unsolved questions that you need to still use imagination to answer, and it could go in a circle and cycle back around to the same person.
Forever remain curious is, I think, one way to think about it. Okay, does anybody else? What kills imagination? Okay, we got a question. Yes, sir.
I can't let Megan have the darts. Does anybody wish to talk about fear and imagination from archaeological discoveries or the sun, what it should have been, perhaps the discovery of young people coming back to their natural life? How does fear impact the potential of imagination? And how do we try to?
Yeah, I'm going to tackle that. At least I'm going to try. One of the things that Omari was talking about was about kids, and I kept thinking about how I read recently this very provocative article about, how children are not that imaginative. It basically was saying that they don't know that much, about the world, and most of the imagination is based on the reality, right? They don't envision anything that is not grounded in reality, right? So I just found it provocative, and it made me think about Dr. Mustaine's question about what stifles, what kills imagination. I thought, well, and your comment about jazz and music made me think. I think it was Miles Davis that used to say, just gotta work very hard on copying somebody else's music, until you start sounding like yourself, right? And so bringing it back to the point of fear, and thinking also on the students when they come back a changed person, right? And I think what would kill imagination, and what I normally see in students, coming back, rediscovering this person that they are, and that they have become, is to let that person out, to let that new self out. And to, again, bringing back Miles Davis, I hope it was Miles Davis, but I think what would kill imagination, right, would be the fear to be yourself, to imagine that you, yourself, can change. And that, I think, if I cannot imagine that I can change, then that would kill completely any image that I would present of myself in the future, right?
Okay. Anybody else? Okay, yes.
So, I just first want to say, this has been so enlightening and so exciting how all of these conversations and all of these threads have just come back to one another. And when Megan asked her question, I immediately thought of Dr. Gonzalez earlier mentioning vulnerability, and that's what was on my mind. And then the next question was about fear. And as a visual artist, I am often on that edge of wanting to put myself out there and then being so terrified that people will actually see who I am. And I have to be vulnerable to show my creativity. In every discipline that's represented in this room, we all have to do that at a certain place. And I feel like as we get older and as we're in professional, we wear these different jackets and these different hats in our lives, we lose that ability to be vulnerable. And I have been at Trinity for 3 years, and I'm so grateful to be home because I feel that Trinity is a place where I can be myself and I can be vulnerable even though it's scary. And I'm just so grateful to be a part of this community, and so I'm so glad, and congratulations, Dr.
Nice. Awesome. Okay. Oh, up here, yes.
It's been interesting to me. I've had a lot of interaction with educational systems overseas, Singapore in the 80s and 90s. Really made a hard push towards skills-based, having very highly technical engineers, programmers, so on and so forth. But then they realized that many of their managers never made it to a higher level of management in companies because they didn't have creative problem-solving skills. And so Singapore, just as an example, tried to bring back creativity, imagination back to the classroom. They did it by having theater classes in primary school, art classes. But, my kind of a question that John thinks that was, how do we bring imagination? If we think before, how do we bring imagination? We have a very unique environment here. Here it is. This is wonderful imagine. But how do we bring imagination to others, whether it's disadvantaged groups or other areas of the world?
I think so. I think it's a great question. I think one way. So historically, as a company, we've taken on a lot of interns from Trinity, and the intent has been, I think, over the last 7 or 8 years, it's about 40 interns, all from different backgrounds, different specialties. And I think one of the things that universally that helps sort of promote the idea of imagination for those students, and then I think that you can replicate for others as well, is sort of creating a sandbox mentality that it's okay to fail in. It's just an opportunity to learn. And so the way in which we've kind of tried to deploy that as a business in the past is that, let's say we have a student who has a background in geosciences, right? Well, what are their opportunities that they want to learn outside that scope? What are questions that I may have that I may not have any answers to? And how can I just throw that question to them and say, like, I don't know the answer to this. Like, you go find the answer to it. You be the expert in it and then come tell me. And know that, like, it's okay to get it wrong in that particular situation, because it's not something, like, being vulnerable enough to say, like, it's not something that I have an answer to. Like, I'm genuinely wanting to engage in dialogue and conversation. And so I think that's an area where we can replicate with others as well, is by bringing that level of, like, it's really just a discovery opportunity. It's a discovery opportunity to use the tools at your disposal. And maybe the tool set that you have looks different than the tool set of a different student or somebody in a different city or somebody in a different country or community. You have a tool set. And so how do we help you understand that that tool set has an opportunity to both expand and has an opportunity to approach a question from a completely different way than anybody else is going to approach that question, and know that that's okay, and know that it's safe to get it right, it's safe to get it wrong, it's safe to have more questions come out of the end of it. It's all of that is okay. And I think when we establish that sort of mentality, it enables an opportunity to then step back and say, like, okay, well then how do I take that and approach it here? Or how do I then take the tool that I saw that person use to approach the question and approach it in this field of work over here? I don't know if that makes any sense.
Yes.
Yeah, I wanted to just talk as a developmentalist, because we've been talking about children, and just talk about, like, early imagination, at least what I know about it, and then some other ideas that came up about why it dies. We know that 3- and 4-year-olds, when they pretend, it's very, very real for them. So when they're pretending that there's a monster coming, they're actually feeling that viscerally. They really are living in this world when they're pretending. And we also know by the age of about 8 or 9, they'll stop playing. So parents will tell you they just now it's time to give away all the toys. There's a point where they'll stop play. And it's really interesting because we think about young children as being these concrete thinkers and moving to abstract thinking when they're 10. That's Piaget. But in a way, they're these abstract thinkers and they move to these more concrete thinkers like we are, and they become very stressed out and get rid of themselves. And so yes, I think fear is part of that, wanting to fit in and not wanting to look weird if you pretend all the time. Imagine how weird you're going to look. Also just having space to play. I really appreciate today too. I am with you because I've been grading exams for like 5 days. And like, is this a 3-point or a 5-point? I'll look at the rubric. Oh, okay. It's stressful boredom. And it's been so nice just to stop and like think and have this. And so I think time to play, time to just rest, time to have fun with each other, even if it's with our thoughts, our ideas. That's what we need. And that's one thing that sometimes we kind of lose as professors sometimes. We're so caught up in all the tasks and all the things, and when we lose that. And so that's why it does feel good to go into the lab, because then, you're with student. Okay, but let's have an hour. Let's try to design an experiment. Let's just talk to each other. What do they do? Why are they failing? Why can't they do this experiment? It's playing in a different way. So yeah, we need that time, but we're so busy reading Google and it's just hard to have. So.
Nice. Everybody does get an A today. Yeah. Ladies and gentlemen, our time is near to an end, and that'll be our last question. Another round of applause for our panelists. How awesome. And a big round of applause to the production team, and there are many people who put this on, so to Tammy and Bruce and Dwayne and Chad and all the production people, thank you so much. It is our hope that today's discussion has ignited your imagination and inspired you to continue to dream big, to tackle big questions with curiosity and excitement in order to meet the challenges we face here at Trinity University and the world beyond, committed to making a better tomorrow for all. Imagine that. Now it gives me great pleasure to welcome to the stage the source, the spark that has ignited our imaginations here at Trinity University, leading us into the next chapter, President Vanessa Beasley.
Thank you. So I had like things I was supposed to say. I'm not going to say any of them. I took a lot of notes, so I'm going to go from the notes. Like, first of all, this is what I imagined Trinity University would be like. I'm serious. And you are, and now I can say, and we are. That means everything to me. So thank you for living up to what I imagined this would be, our community would be. These last two comments especially really speak to that, right? I heard people yesterday speaking to this idea, why don't we have a community-wide service day, once a year? Because so many people were having fun, not just performing acts of service, but also just being in community together, away from the stressful boredom, which is now my favorite phrase for anything. Jamie, that was great, right? So just this opportunity to learn from each other, to listen to each other, and not just to do those things in their own right, but the way we do them here. Do you know what I mean? The way we talk and listen to each other here. I'm just cherishing that right now, so thank you. Here's what I was thinking about while you were talking, and I was thinking, I'm not going to say these planned remarks. I want to talk about The Last of Us. Who's watching that? Okay, if you're not watching it, it's kind of zombie except fungus and end of the world, all of the sort of dystopian things. And my husband and I are watching it. And I was, as you were talking about all the different ways you all approach imagination, and then we started going there with, I can't imagine how my computer works either, right? And then we went to all the other places and landed on fear, thinking about watching the show The Last of Us. And really, if you've seen any Walking Dead, anything like that, right? The Last of Us is really good. You should watch it. But we're talking about dystopia. Dystopia is a form of imagination, right? And when I think about dystopian fiction or whatever keeps you up in the middle of the night, however that fear manifests, what today's conversation helped me realize is that there's always this productive tension, you nailed it, I think, between what's rooted in our experience. Jenny talked about the sensory, right? We talk about image. We have to have been able to have seen it, to have felt it, before we can grieve its loss. So thinking about the imagination in the academy could be the way to envision this super productive tension between what's rooted, what's known, what's fixed, how we understand those vocabularies of fixity, which are really all we're teaching in our classrooms all the time, right? How do you study this thing? What's the proper methodology? And like the jazz metaphor, how do we learn how to do a proper chord formation before we can start to do a riff, right? Starting with that level of fixity and groundedness, and then with the grasp, literally, as you all were talking, I was thinking about what imagination in the academy is. It's how we all reach, right? It's how we all reach. It's how we all pretend that we're announcing the weather. It's going from the sensory to something that's almost metaphysical, that's outside of our senses, that's outside of ourselves. And as you all were talking about that, the connection to me with the last few statements was how much courage that takes, right? To reach outside yourself. To connect it with dystopia and fear, some people don't have another choice, which is, I think, what you're driving at, right? And what Oliver's question was driving at. And especially as we think about how easy it is to Google things, maybe part of our problem, and I mean us in the room with the level of privilege and choice we have here today, right? Maybe what kills our imagination is the fact that I don't have to remember who wrote that book, I Google it, right? Maybe we have too many tools that are keeping us in our fixity and our certainty of needing to know things right away that we're not grasping, or we're not taking the time to grasp together, the time out of time, right? Think about how many of the ways we talked today had to do with filling space and making space, right? There's that productive tension again. Filling space because you see a gap, and making space because you want to reach outside yourself. So, many of the things I was supposed to talk to you about are about, of course, how wonderful Trinity University is. Many of the things I was supposed to talk to you about are, of course, about how what I really love about what we do together is as simple as the thing we always say, right? Answering questions, questioning answers, and how we did that here today. Now, I am going to put in something I was supposed to say, which is about interdisciplinarity and how well we do that together, and the courage it takes to do that, right? Particularly for faculty. Somebody told me once, because my research is also interdisciplinary, somebody told me once, being an interdisciplinary scholar means having the courage for at least half the room to tell you you're wrong. Right? And that's what it means. Because our rootedness as scholars is in a particular vocabulary, and it is risky to step out of that to ask a new question, which is that grasping again. So all of those things are what I was going to say about interdisciplinarity. And then one of our students, who's an applied physics major, quoted Immanuel Kant. And I thought, I don't need to say that. I think we just saw that. So again, I want to thank you for making what I imagined actually come true, for making this a place where we can dream and dare to dream together, a place where we can study things while they're occurring, after they're occurring, before they're occurring, this idea of futurity. And we can talk about not only what we're afraid of, but also what we're hopeful about, right? And sometimes that's the tension too, taking those things that we're really afraid of, and especially if you get to a place of fear or scarcity in your own life, having the opportunity to say, all right, I don't have a choice. I must imagine a different path right now, right? I must do that. And to do that in community is about as good as it gets. So thank you all for being on this panel today. I am supposed to remind you that there's a reception, and due to the weather conditions, my understanding it has been moved to Laurie Auditorium Gallery, just outside of our beloved KRTU. Enjoy the reception. Thank you again.
I'll swing back. What time is it? It is 5:28.
Thank you.